Hi, and welcome to Behind the Lens, the creation of a photography series. I'm Anthony Lamb, a fine art photographer. I've been photographing for almost 21 years, 8 of those as a full-time professional. Today, I'm going to share how I create a photography series or collection of images. The project I'll focus on was captured in Venice in 2024. We'll explore my process from finding locations to editing images, and finally I'll share the completed series at the end. So sit back, grab a coffee or a tea and enjoy the journey. Where ideas begin. Every project starts with inspiration. That foundation can come from many places: other artists, colour palettes, compositions, or even your own past work. Before I set foot in Venice, I already had influences in mind. Turner's stunning watercolours taught me how light can be visualised with softness and delicacy. Canaletto's oils showed me the power of bold contrast and rich detail. Both styles, Turner's gentle pastels and Canaletto's strong contrasts, inspired my editing approach. I also drew inspiration from the US-based artist Zaria Foreman. Her use of pastels to create large-scale, ethereal landscapes of icy regions. She blends colours with her fingers, creating moody yet calming scenes. Her sombre blues particularly resonate with me. I've always gravitated toward blue, both in my clothing and my photography. And you'll notice this colour is prominent in my Venice work. And then there's my own photography. I included one of my images from Normandy in France, a simple composition with a soft pastel palette. It became a benchmark for the style and mood I wanted to achieve in Venice. By holding these influences in my mind, I had a clear, creative direction before even boarding the plane. Looking back at your own work can be just as valuable as studying others. 2 images I shot on the south and east coasts of the UK are perfect examples. Both carry a calming blue tonality. Some see blue as sombre or sad. I see it as peaceful and meditative. These images were captured using an ND filter, and I leaned into the blue cast it produced that enhanced the mood. In early 2024, I photographed the Seychelles with the idea of creating timeless black and white images. But the raw landscapes felt almost prehistoric, so I edited them within the creamy sepia tone instead, again chasing a sense of timelessness. And in 2023, my Jabit series in Normandy and Brittany captured painterly, minimal compositions. These became another visual reference point for my trip to Italy. Some photographers prefer to wander without a plan, but researching in advance can save a lot of time. I've been thinking about photographing Venice for 2 to 3 years prior to me going there. Before I arrived, I had already mapped out locations using Google Maps and Google Earth. Yellow stars marked possible spots. Red hearts marked my top choices. Street View became a powerful tool, letting me walk through streets virtually and preview compositions before arriving. One example is Burano, a smaller island northeast of Venice. I could explore its colourful streets online and mark spots worth visiting. But I never limit myself to only these points. Some of the best finds happen while walking between planned locations, keeping my eyes open for unexpected scenes. Google Images can also be useful, but I don't use it to copy shots. This search is for Fine Art Photography Venice. It shows me which spots are over-photographed and where there might be room for originality. Sometimes it's as simple as changing the angle or focus on a smaller detail. Finding truly original compositions in a city like Venice is almost impossible, but you can still create images that feel personal, expressive, and distinct. Planning the trip is one of the most important stages. First, when to go. Venice in July and August is hot, crowded, and overwhelming. I chose February 2024, hoping for fog and mist. 3 days before travelling, I saw a fog forecast for 5 straight days and booked immediately. Not everyone can drop everything at short notice, I understand. So choose your timing based on the light, weather, and atmosphere you want to capture. Weather is critical. If you want ethereal, moody images, you still need stillness, soft light, or mist. If the conditions aren't right the first time, use weather apps to track changes and return to a location when the light is better. The itinerary. I'm not a spreadsheet photographer. I like to work organically, but I spend maybe 20 minutes each evening deciding where I'll head next day. That small effort saves time, reduces stress, and lets me focus on capturing the best possible images during my trip. Accommodation is more important than most people think. I always choose somewhere central to the locations I've planned to shoot. This way, I'm not wasting valuable time travelling back and forth. The closer I am, the more flexible I can be if the light changes or the weather shifts. I also keep an eye on value for money. I don't need a spa or a pool if I'm out shooting all day. A comfortable bed, somewhere nearby for food and supplies, and quick access to my chosen spots. That's what matters most. I'm here to work, not a holiday. Gear and equipment is also really important. For this trip to Venice, I travelled light when it came to gear. I didn't want to be carrying heavy equipment for hours on end. I used the Fujifilm GFX 100S with 2 lenses, the 32-64mm and the 100-200mm. Enough range for my needs without weighing me down. I bought a small selection of filters, Nissi NDs, Lee NDs and Lee graduated filters, along with a polarizer. My tripod was a lightweight Leofoto with an umbrella attachment, and I used a great trick from the photographer Thomas Heaton, placing 3 old CDs under each leg to spread the weight on soft ground. The rest was essentials: spare batteries, memory cards, charger, cleaning cloth, and a cable release. Everything fits neatly into my low pro bag that doubled as my carry-on for the flight, keeping my kit with me at all times. The collection from this trip is titled Veneto, named after the region that includes Venice and the surrounding islands. If you'd like to read the background on this project, feel free to pause the video now. The first image I captured on my very first day in thick fog, where visibility was no more than about 30 meters. Most photographers shoot this particular spot with a straight leading line towards the guard's boat hut, seen in the center of the image. I composed it slightly differently, using a subtle Z-shaped path, using the tower on the left to anchor the shot. The mist softened the buildings until they almost fade into nothing. The first few days were bitterly cold, February in Venice, and I wanted my edits to reflect that. I introduced blue tones to give a sense of the freezing, misty air. In one shot of mooring posts, I resisted using a long exposure, choosing instead to shoot at a 30th of a second to preserve the slight movement in the reflections. On a small peninsula, I photographed the posts normally used for mooring boats. This time, no boat was tied up there, which it normally is, which gave more space in the frame, making it much more minimalistic. I left the rope in as well, It connected the post to the building and added a small narrative. Some of the images were taken at locations that, on a clear day, would be completely unremarkable. A small boat guard's hut, for instance, looked entirely ordinary in normal weather, but in the fog it seemed to float, surrounded by evenly muted tones. Another photograph from the Grand Canal shows perfectly symmetrical posts, except one had moved slightly during the exposure. I embraced that imperfection. I also positioned the boards so that they were slightly offset, ensuring that the posts didn't merge visually. In another pair of images, I explore the theme of stillness and reflection. One was taken from the main island, using a small boardwalk as a leading line to a central post, fading away into the mist. The other was captured on Lido, where a lone pine tree seemed to be in conversation with a distant mooring post. Their relationship mirrored perfectly in the water. One of my favourite minimalist compositions was of evenly spaced mooring posts, made possible only by the fog. On a normal day, the scene would be cluttered with visual distractions. Here, the long exposure and the mist combined to create a painterly calm. Later in the trip, I shifted to a warmer palette for a set inspired by the Venetian painter Canaletto. His work is famous for its bold colour and strong composition. In one busy channel, I had to be patient. It took 5 to 7 long exposures before I could finally capture the scene without boat trails cutting through it. In editing, I kept the vibrancy of the buildings but softened the orange tones, aiming for a balance between realism and that painterly quality I wanted to evoke. This image overlooks the lagoon of Venice towards San Giorgio. It was probably taken at sunset. I used a long exposure technique, and because it was cloudy, I managed to capture texture in the sky and a muted aesthetic in the water. You can just see some of the light behind me reflecting on the buildings of San Giorgio. The mist is still present, though in smaller amounts here. If you look at the horizon, you'll notice the trees are slightly muted from the thin mist. By this point, it was the 4th or 5th day of the trip, and the mist would appear in the morning, then burn off by 10 or 11 o'clock. Here I'm looking across from the mainland of Venice towards San Michele. Believe it or not, this structure is another island off the coast, and it's stunning at the right time of day. Captured in the morning, possibly on the same day as the San Giorgio shot, the colours are muted, and in cloudy conditions, saturation almost feels softer and more subtle. When I edited this image, there were a few markers and posts visible in the water. Because of the long exposure, I wanted the least amount of distractions, so I used the clone tool to remove a few of them. You can still see the mist on the horizon muting the distance. I've paired these two images because of their crop and format. On the left is the Rialto Bridge, one of Venice's most famous landmarks, crossing the Grand Canal. I captured it early one morning, probably around 9 o'clock in the morning. There were still tourists on the bridge, but thanks to the long exposure, the traffic on the canal became a soft, milky texture. One boat did pass underneath the bridge just before the exposure ended, so I removed some of those blurry lines to keep the image clean. The second shot is a homage to Canaletto. The deep contrast and subtle colours are reminiscent of his oil paintings of Venice. Achieving a sense of flow across the series is so important to me, so each image follows a distinct style but shares a consistent colour and tone. In my research, I plotted specific buildings to photograph, not just the famous landmarks, but everyday scenes that capture how people live in the city. These buildings were on my list long before I arrived. Each is edited in a similar style, yet they remain individual in character. I'm drawn to the smaller details, the way light hits the walls, the textures in the plaster, the lived-in feel. One of those buildings, seen on the right-hand side of the pair, actually appeared in James Bond movie with Daniel Craig. Interestingly, the building in the middle of that frame wasn't real for the film itself. They built a scale model to replicate the architecture on either side. They still managed to match the surrounding tones and colours perfectly. I also created a set of sepia-toned images for Venice. This sepia view of the Rialto Bridge on the Grand Canal has an almost timeless quality. It was taken at the same time as the colour version, but as a wider panorama. The emotional feel is completely different. Another sepia image of San Giorgio was captured in the evening. The building's light glows softly on the left side, yet the sepia finish hides the time of day. That's what I love about black and white or toned photography. You're left to use your own intuition. Lastly, I reprocessed one of my colour images in sepia. Seeing the same composition in this style gives it a completely new emotional weight. On my last day in Venice, I woke early and headed to San Marco. A thin layer of mist hovered over the square as the sun began to rise, filling it with soft colour. The building's lines were subtle, almost ghostly, yet still distinct enough to capture. I stayed there for 2 hours, trying different compositions as the sun rose higher and the colours deepened. It reminded me so much of Turner's watercolours, the pastel tones, the gentle light, and the absence of distractions. This was my homage to Joseph Turner, a moment where the camera came closest to painting with light. The next frame, which I titled Falling Colour, came as the sun's light filled the mist with pastel shades, reflected in the long exposed water below. Another photographer stopped briefly, stayed for maybe 10 minutes and left, missing the best light. I was so glad I stayed. Later that morning, I travelled north to catch a ferry to Burano. While waiting, I looked across the lagoon to San Michele. I couldn't resist. I set up my tripod and took a long exposure. I missed my ferry but didn't mind. Another would come in half an hour or so. Some images are worth missing a boat for. By the time I arrived in Burano, the mist had already burned away. I already knew what I wanted to capture, the facades of colourful, characterful houses along one of the main canals. These houses were chosen in advance from my research, but seeing them in person was even better. The separation between buildings, the unique colours, and the lived-in details drew me in. In one image, a freshly painted red facade contrasts with an older, distressed building beside it. Wires run across the front, an olive tree grows to the right, and each element tells a story. Another shot, one of the set of maybe 10 or 12 images, was a more spontaneous choice. I loved the way these 3 buildings sat together, framed by the cactuses, bikes and shutters, with a tree that seemed to belong to the scene. I almost didn't take it because of the shadow in the foreground, but the balance between the tree and buildings convinced me to press the shutter. Finally, here's a behind-the-scenes look at editing one of my chosen images. A jetty on the Grand Canal. The raw file shows a gloomy atmosphere, but the composition is strong. By increasing the exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, the image begins to come alive. Next, I adjusted the colour balance toward blue, then duplicated the layer to remove that blue from the posts and jetty. I fine-tuned the hue, saturation and luminance, adding a touch of green while reducing stronger colours. Gradients were added to both the sky and the foreground water. I call this my letterbox approach drawing the viewer's eye directly to the main subject, in this case, the posts. Final tweaks to shadows and saturation brought the image in line with the rest of the collection. Colour balance is a key element when post-processing images. For me, it was especially important while editing these photos from Venice that the viewer could sense the weather I experienced on location. Take this image, for example. By adjusting the colour temperature, I can almost justify the weather conditions. If I push the temperature to the right, warming the tones and adding more yellow, it gives the viewer a completely different emotional feeling. Warmer, sunnier, more inviting. Conversely, pulling the colour balance to the left, cooling the tones, helps recreate the atmosphere I actually felt on site. Cooler, more subdued and moody. The same principle applies in black and white editing, but it behaves differently. Pushing the blue tones can create an almost logo-like or branded effect, which may not suit the mood of the image. Instead, pulling out the yellow and reducing the saturation can give a creamier, softer aesthetic. Finally, take the image of the Rialto Bridge. Using warmer yellow tones gives the buildings and bridge a welcoming glow, while cooler blue tones create a completely different mood, leaving the viewer uncertain about the weather the photographer experienced. So, don't underestimate the power of colour balance. It's a subtle yet powerful tool that helps determine the mood and feeling you want your photographs to convey. Thank you so much for watching this presentation. I hope it inspires you as you head out with your camera on your next project.